So I hope you've enjoyed our demonstration on why we need more innovation. Oh.
Video.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just turn things back over to Tim.
Thank you so much, and hopefully you're all reinvigorated after that excitement. Moving on to our next speaker. So we said earlier, Tholos, it's about bringing together business, academia, politics. So we've heard from politics and academia. Now moving to the field of business. Our next speaker, Ramūnas Mačius, is the Vice President of Fiscal Affairs and Anti-Illicit Trade at Japan Tobacco International, where he's responsible for designing global excise tax strategies and coordinating the growing problems with illicit trade. And in fact also, though, does have a background in politics, advising the Lithuanian government and the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, to our next speaker.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Prometheus, for bringing the light, the energy, and video back. On a more serious note, I represent tobacco industry, and it's perhaps the most regulated of all industries. From seed, which is put in the ground, how it's grown, how it's harvested, how it moved into production, how it moved from production to the shops, and how it reaches consumer. We have vast experience how regulation can be shaped, both positive and also not so positive. And I can talk for ages about it. Now, coming to the innovation aspect, about a decade or so ago, our industry, which is hundreds of years old, got stuck by similar event like this power outage. I mean, a lot of innovation came into the field. Due to technology, due to consumer move, we got so-called electronic nicotine delivery systems. And those products became popular with consumer, first of all, but also they brought less harmful way to bring nicotine to consumers. Therefore, that innovation was very welcome because it brings positive impact for society. Having this movement in, the question how regulation can address, and in broader terms, we see three ways. One is do nothing, and we heard quite a lot of the sentiment that innovation can be facilitated and welcomed without intervention of the government. However, when you talk about product, ours, it unfortunately has sensitive consumer groups, youth. You don't want addictive products end up in underage people. So, and that's what happens if you don't have regulation, therefore regulation is needed. We have another extreme when governments think that those products should not be around at all, so-called preventive approach, and they ban it, which also doesn't work because consumer is very simple. He will get a product irrespective it's legally sold or illegally. And we see proliferation of illegal product, unfortunately, in the countries where the new electronic nicotine delivery systems are banned. So our approach to the regulation is, in face of these new products, is to have a regulation. You need it. You need it to protect the consumer, to protect those vulnerable groups of consumers, but also give clarity to the business. There are massive R&D investments into the categories, and we need clarity how this investment could be done. Therefore, our way forward as a business is to have meaningful, smart regulation, which would encourage innovation, but at the same time provide the rules.
Thank you very much. So tying all of these sorts of threads together, our last speaker, Chrysa Kazakou, who is an international fellow with us at the Tholos Foundation, but she's also an EU qualified lawyer with a BA in law and an MA in international legal studies. She has vast experience working as a lawyer for both governments and in private practice, focusing on the protection of intellectual property rights, corporate agreements and data protection. And she was a co-author of the 2021 International Trademark and Patent Index.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for having me. Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Σας ευχαριστούμε που είστε εδώ μαζί μας για αυτή τη συζήτηση. It's not a cliché that all those massive advances on technology or the popular term disruptive innovation have led to better quality of products and services for consumers and for each of us for our everyday lives. Some common digital innovations that have become our best friends is artificial intelligence, drones, fintech, and others, who are more and more become more popular from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. each day. All those innovations have contributed to the digital space. They have also raised specular legal and regulatory burdens. I'm currently working in the technology sector, and I must confess that every single day we may face regulatory burdens when we want to provide our services. Considering this, and going back to the theme of our panel, I think that we need to understand what a balanced market needs so the competition does not suffer at the cost of a regulatory, disruptive technological environment. So personally, me as a lawyer and all the legal groups that we have this discussion quite often, we think that there are two types of challenges for traditional regulation. I will present only one, the one for the business, what is called pacing problem. So it's one of the biggest business challenges. That means our existing legal framework in Europe and international, it's quite slow in adapting all the fast-changing technological innovations. The regulatory agencies and the governments around the world are also risk-averse, which inhibits better regulation. Once the rules are out and the regulatory model is in effect, we cannot rarely reconsider it, and the change could happen after 5 or even 10 years. Except from the problems, and I don't want to criticize at all, but I will turn later to my recommendations, I would like to point out what is very important for us in business, governments, industry, think tanks, and every people that is working in the industry. Except so for the regulatory and traditional regulatory burdens, we need to underline how important it is, and still it's a bit underestimated, the protection of intellectual property rights. Personally, I would like to draw your attention in the protection of patents. So before 1 year, I had the opportunity with the think tank of Property Rights Alliance, American University and Professor Dr. Walter Park, to compile data from around 142 countries around the world so as to understand how the patents are being protected. Just to note that this has not to be as a qualification or a criticism of patent systems, but we just wanted to understand if perhaps me, myself, or each of you wants to be an investor, how he can try to choose a country so as to fulfill an attachment and an application for a patent so as to cover his business model or everything that he wants to be published during his business experience. So this index has been measuring the patent protection around the countries involved, and the US, Japan, and Germany lead the score, while Myanmar and Fiji have the lowest scores. We concluded in that index that the weak protection of patents poses a significant barrier to international technology licensing, but it reduces a lot direct investments. On the contrary, IP laws in countries with strong and flexible regulatory frameworks illustrate that assets of right holders are fully protected, even when sharing viable platform technology with other companies. These laws serve as a critical example to balance the interest of rewarding the others, the owners of enterprise, with the interest of larger community so as to benefit all the innovation. After these 2 points that I wanted for everyone to consider, first, the protection of IP and specifically patents, and secondly, the regulatory burdens of the traditional regulation, I would like to give some recommendations so as to stick to that tradition of the lawyer that likes at the end to say the final word, without any flavor of criticism again. So there are 3 directives in the current situation for the regulators, and 3 directives that all the regulators, legal world, and the industry wants to take over. Firstly, regulators need a proactive approach to adopt, so as a thorough risk assessment needs to be in place to identify potential threats. Secondly, except from the legislative proposals that are around all the legislative systems in the world, a rapid feedback mechanism will be an essential component so as to enable the regulatory system to evaluate the policies and not only implement rules against certain set standards. Finally, I believe that regulators may design regulatory processes which mirror the growth phases of business as far as possible, aligning regulatory requirements with different technological approaches. So just in 2 words, we need the right pace and the right flexibility so as not to keep putting burdens and problems to the business, but just facilitate their job and also to help our consumers to have a better quality of life.
Thank you. So for my first question, I think I'd like to turn to Mr. Kefalogiannis. And it's sort of a 2-part question in that, first of all, you mentioned a few challenges facing Europe and the world. What would you consider probably the most important challenge or the problem that Europe has to face in the coming years? But as a sort of follow-up from that, what would be the impact of the looming, if we do end up getting these policies wrong, if Europe loses its sort of technological, its scientific advantage, and like, what would be the consequences if we get the answers to these challenges wrong?
Μιας και το θέμα μας είναι η καινοτομία, στο επόμενο διάστημα το πρώτο που πρέπει να κάνει η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, η οποία είναι κατά πολύ περισσότερο ορισμένη και με πολλούς νόμους και πολλές φορές αντιφατικούς, να πάει σε μια λογική deregulation of the rules of the European Union. Αλλά αυτό που πρέπει να κάνει η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση, η οποία είναι το πιο πετυχημένο παράδειγμα στον κόσμο, λαών οι οποίοι είχαν τεράστια προβλήματα μεταξύ τους για δεκαετίες, είναι να προχωρήσει προς την ομοσπονδιακή της κατεύθυνση. Η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση δεν μπορεί να προχωρήσει στο μέλλον εάν δεν έχει κάποιας μορφής ομοσπονδία. Οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες διαχειρίζονται το 6% του ακαθάριστου εθνικού τους προϊόντος για την ομοσπονδία. Η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση το 1%. Με το 1% δεν μπορεί να κάνει πολιτικές. Γιατί οι πολιτικές ξεκινούν ως όραμα και δεν λειτουργούν ή δεν ολοκληρώνονται στο μέλλον. Για παράδειγμα, συζητούμε τώρα την κοινή αμυντική πολιτική στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Αυτή η πολιτική ξεκίνησε το 1952. Αποφάσισε η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση τότε πριν από την ΕΟΚΑΝ, όταν σκεφτόμαστε να προχωρήσουμε, να κάνει την Ευρωπαϊκή Αμυντική Ένωση. Δεν προχώρησε. 2 βουλευτές από τη Γαλλία μειοψήφισαν. Δεν προχώρησε αυτό το όραμα, γιατί η ειρήνη ήταν το πρώτο ζητούμενο. Δημιουργήσαμε την Δυτικοευρωπαϊκή Ένωση στα μέσα της δεκαετίας του 50. Κανείς δεν κατάλαβε τη λειτουργία της. Δεν προσέφερε τίποτα στην άμυνα της Ευρώπης. Χρήματα δεν υπήρχαν. Έκλεισε τον κύκλο της στα μέσα της δεκαετίας του 60. Σήμερα βλέπουμε τον πόλεμο. Βλέπουμε ότι η Ευρώπη δεν μπορεί να προχωρήσει χωρίς ασφάλεια και άμυνα και ξαναξεκινούμε αυτή την προσπάθεια μετά από 80 χρόνια. Εάν λοιπόν η Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση δεν βάλει το χέρι στην τσέπη να δώσει χρήματα για κοινές πολιτικές, ακόμα και στην οικονομία, κοινή τραπεζική πολιτική, κοινή οικονομική πολιτική, κοινή φορολογική πολιτική, κοινοί κανόνες, μια πραγματική εσωτερική αγορά ακόμα για την καινοτομία. Κάθε κράτος έχει τους δικούς της νόμους, το δικό της σύστημα χρηματοδότησης και τα δικά της κίνητρα. Άρα η λύση της Ευρώπης είναι μόνο ομοσπονδιακή. Και εκεί χρειάζεται ηγεσία. Και η ηγεσία πρέπει αυτά να τα αποφασίσει. Και να τα υλοποιήσει.
So my next question will be to Ramūnas. This is an issue that's of particular interest to me because I know from my native Australia the disastrous impact of bad tobacco policy where there is horrific organised crime, there is a large illicit and black market controlled by criminal syndicates, and yet reduced risk products are banned legally for most people. But you are correct that there is that need for a balance between to just try and protect youth, etc. What guiding principles should policymakers look at to strive in your particular industry to reach that appropriate balance between the two? But could you also give some counterproductive examples of maybe where the balance has been not gotten right, maybe here in Europe? Because I already know about the one in Australia.
Yeah, I will not talk a lot about Australia, but US, which is often mentioned as a hub for innovation. And with regard of tobacco product, there is a regulatory framework which is very robust. Unfortunately, if you go letter by letter in order to market the product in US, you need to invest several $1 million into proving to authorities that this product can be in the market. So it's overly complicated, and as a paradox coming from a very free and liberal market, it's been criticized multiple times because it simply doesn't work. In paper, it's written nicely, but because of that huge entry barrier, several $1 million, a lot of players simply don't abide by the rule, so we have a lot of non-compliant product in the market. So it doesn't work. An example where it works much better is Europe, actually. We have a tobacco product directive which sets certain rules, and also Greece has also a local legislation which is not ideal, but what we are very happy that government is talking to the industry. It looks for potential solutions, how it can be simplified, how it can be better understood by the players, by the businesses, by investors. And equally important, if you introduce the rules, you have to make sure that they are followed through. In so many innovative cases, you get investors or businesses which comply, and the ones which simply go after consumer irrespective, and the ones which are suffering are the compliant ones, because they normally invest more in order to be safe, to produce safe product by standard. So what we would expect from government, therefore, is that collaborative approach, talk how to make more simple rules, more clear rules, and equally important that those rules are followed through and there is an enforcement mechanism behind.
And I think that's a really interesting point that you make because like in the United States, you might have really good rules on paper, but the Soviet Union guaranteed freedoms in their constitution, and we all know what happened there. So, and yet you also have other cases where you also have good rules on paper, but it's the companies that comply with the rules that are penalised. So there's always that question of not just the rules themselves, but governments need to think about how they work in the real world. And I think this is something that people don't often think about, that it's not just enough to write laws in a vacuum. You have to have that real-world regulation. So I would like to maybe move and see if either Chrysa or Dr. Lingle, you might have any thoughts just to expand on, are there any guiding principles to think about when creating regulation in terms of that sort of interplay between what's on paper and what's in reality. So, Dr. Lengel.
Going back to my opening remarks about regulating human behavior, what we have to consider is the generality that it affects everyone, and it affects them equally, whether you're in the family being regulated or in society. Easy to understand. If you're a child, you get punished for misbehaving, and so on. But the other element that's missing is accountability, because in the private sector regulation, there's clear accountability, and there's clear understanding of costs, the compliance costs. So when you are being regulated by sort of agreement within a particular market framework, bureaucrats and politicians impose and enforce regulations without any accountability. They have good intentions, but they're not measured in the real world. The regulations are measured by the real effect. If they get it wrong, if their good intentions lead to bad results, who pays the cost? Well, presumably, ultimately it's the consumer, but in the meantime, it'll be the business of the company that is affected by it. One other aspect I think we need to be very clear about is that the only engine of economic growth is the entrepreneur. The state can facilitate or obviate or interfere with that growth. They can set a good condition for it, but they cannot. Well, there are a few exceptions like the Kalashnikov, a few sort of weapons of destruction that states are very good at creating. But other than that, we have to understand that if regulations do not start with an understanding that entrepreneur is the best friend of the consumer, not the bureaucrat, not the politician, because the entrepreneur is accountable to the consumer in a way that politicians are not. They're accountable in the sense of they're protecting their brand. They're accountable in terms of providing something that creates value in the eyes of the consumer in ways that state actors are not.
I totally agree with the point of the accountability that you have mentioned, and I just think that we need, again, to share more light on this tool of an open dialogue and accessible to policymakers, to legislators, to regulators, to legal groups of the business, so as to identify as early as possible any implications or any burdens or restrictions that could lead to a stifling innovation.
So, and this is a question maybe if every single panellist can answer in turn. If very, very briefly, because we do have to wrap up fairly shortly due to the issues of earlier, starting with, from the far end, if you were to have a magic wand to implement one policy to really stimulate innovation, to stimulate and spur on this technological change through unleashed prosperity, what would each of you say would be the most important thing? Let's limit it to the EU as where we are, that the EU can do specifically to stimulate that sort of innovation and technological growth.
Κοινές πολιτικές, ολοκλήρωση οικονομική και λιγότεροι νόμοι, deregulation. Αυτό πρέπει να είναι το μήνυμα στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Αλλιώς κινδυνεύουμε από αυτό που έχουμε σήμερα, που έχουμε 3,5 μεγάλες δυνάμεις στον κόσμο, το 2050 να έχουμε μόνο μισή. Και αυτή θα είναι η Γερμανία. Και συνεργασία με τους άλλους λαούς να προχωρήσουμε πολιτικές που είναι προκλήσεις των εποχών. Εμείς στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση έχουμε κάνει ένα πρόγραμμα για το Green Deal ύψους 1 τρισεκατομμυρίου ευρώ. Είχα την τιμή να εισηγηθώ το πρώτο νομοσχέδιο, το οποίο ήταν το Ταμείο Δίκαιης Μετάβασης, ενός ποσού 130 δισεκατομμυρίων ευρώ. Το ΑΕΠ της Ελλάδος είναι 200 κοντά δισεκατομμύρια ευρώ. Αυτά όλα θα πρέπει να γίνουν σε συμφωνία και με τα άλλα μέρη του κόσμου, γιατί αλλιώς στην Ευρώπη μπορεί να είναι πολλοί οι νόμοι, πολλά τα δεδομένα, πολλοί οι έλεγχοι και στο τέλος του δρόμου να προσθέσουν καμία προστιθέμενη αξία ούτε στην έρευνα και στην καινοτομία, ούτε στην προστιθέμενη αξία στην οικονομία. Αυτό πιστεύω λοιπόν πως πρέπει να είναι το επόμενο βήμα για την Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση μέσα στον κόσμο, ως παράγοντα σταθερότητας και ειρήνης.
Thank you. Dr. Lingle?
In the regulation of the money supply, I'm an economist, the most destructive force besides standing armies in humanity are central banks. They have driven us into a global debt bubble. They regulate interest rates as though risk has no meaning. So, again, central banks are really, I think, the biggest threat to prosperity, human liberty, and entrepreneurial. I mean, entrepreneurs don't there's no estimation of risk anymore. If you have a zero or a negative nominal interest rate, what does risk have? Risk has no meaning because you're not putting at risk your money, you're putting at risk someone else's money. So that was probably an unexpected answer, but that's mine.
Two very different answers so far. Continuing.
Yes, and as Dr. Christopher mentioned, starting from family, we need rules. We live in rule-based society. Rule of law is essential for modern world. Therefore, I think we're all in agreement regulation is something which is needed for innovation as well. However, the rules should be as simple, as easy to understand as possible, given the complexity, of course, of current world. And as a second element, they should be enforced. There should be accountability from the industry, from government, from consumers, and everybody should understand that those principles, rules, they exist as integral part of a society.
And to have the final word on this panel, Chrysa.
I'm taking again your point. I agree to the holistic conformance of rule of law, but pointing out a step before the implementation, I think that we need much simpler procedures for implementing from regulating and creating regulations, first, and second, to be time effective and less, more flexible, to be mirroring all the industry needs.
Thank you very much, and if you can thank all of our speakers.